In a recent podcast interview, Professor Jeffrey Sachs went off on what some might consider to be an anti-American rant.
There has been no diplomacy whatsoever with Russia. And every action the United States has taken since then has been unilateral. The U.S. withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia in 2002 unilaterally, not on the basis of negotiation. The United States expanded NATO to 7 more countries in 2004 against promises made and against Russia's express opposition to the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia in 2004. The United States invited Ukraine and Georgia to become members of NATO without any negotiation with Russia. The United States participated in a violent coup against the Ukrainian government without diplomacy with Russia. The United States undermined and effectively torpedoed the Minsk agreements without diplomacy with Russia. When President Putin said I should add, the United States unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement in 2019 without diplomacy with Russia. In 2021, when President Putin said we urgently need a new security arrangement, in December 15th, 2021, the United States explicitly refused to engage. When Ukraine and Russia reached a tentative peace agreement in March 2022, the United States sent the word, "Do not sign an agreement, no negotiation." When President Putin said we are open for negotiations, the United States response is there's no one to negotiate with. There is no diplomacy.
What did he just say?
Well, first, who is this guy? Among many other positions and achievements, Jeffrey Sachs was a Harvard professor for 20 years, has served as a special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretary Generals, including the present one. He was the chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission and is currently university professor at Columbia University.
The U.S. withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia in 2002 unilaterally.
The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was signed in 1972. The ABM Treaty was kind of important for several reasons, primarily because it played a critical role in maintaining strategic stability during the Cold War. Not only did it limit the number of ABM sites and systems, it established a precedent for future arms control agreements and verification measures. The U.S. announced its withdrawal in 2001 and withdrew from it in 2002. As CNN reported, Bush said in the White House Rose Garden, "I have concluded the ABM Treaty hinders our government's ability to develop ways to protect our people from future terrorist or rogue state missile attacks." 20 years later, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace wrote, quote, "It's clear now that withdrawing was an epic mistake. The United States homeland missile defenses are porous. Why else would Washington worry that North Korea is developing intercontinental ballistic missiles?"
The United States expanded NATO to 7 more countries in 2004 against promises made and against Russia's express opposition.
What were those countries again?
I'd like, on behalf of my colleagues in the North Atlantic Council, to welcome the Presidents and Prime Ministers of Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia to this special meeting of the North Atlantic Council.
And what did Gorbachev think of that?
I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about.
But were promises made only to be broken? Not according to Robert Zoellick, the U.S. diplomat who played a role in negotiating the deal. But when the German Newsweekly Der Spiegel looked at it shortly after the expansion, they found something odd. Newly discovered documents from Western archives support the Russian position. Documents from Western archives. And where are those documents? In the National Security Archive. Declassified documents show security assurances against NATO expansion to Soviet leaders from Baker, Bush, Genscher, Kohl, Gates, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Hurd, Major, and Werner. For those too young to know, those are the names of the main democratically elected leaders at the time for the United States, Britain, France, and Germany.
The United States participated in a violent coup against the Ukrainian government without diplomacy.
Reporting at the time of the coup in Kiev was relatively open about the Nazi-inspired bands who took control. Far-right nationalists and fascists have been at the heart of the protests and attacks on government buildings. Far-right extremists at core of democracy protest. But what does that have to do with the United States? One way or another, a telephone conversation between the United States ambassador to the Ukraine and Victoria Nuland, the Assistant U.S. Secretary of State, was recorded and leaked to the press. But while the Western press focused on her feelings for the EU, the conversation itself contained more important details.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
Sullivan's come back to me VFR saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
So you had this remarkable phone call where you have these two senior officials of the U.S. government apparently talking about a coup or how they were planning to restructure the government of Ukraine.
Perhaps it was only a coincidence, but 2 weeks later a coup toppled the constitutional government of the Ukraine, and a short time after that, Nuland's choice led the new, albeit violently imposed, government.
The United States undermined and effectively torpedoed the Minsk agreements.
What are the Minsk agreements? Well, according to The Economist, quote, the product of a marathon all-night negotiating session, Minsk II offers a detailed roadmap for the resolving of the conflict. The 13-point plan begins with a ceasefire and the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front lines, to be monitored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And what did the OSCE have to say? Well, the chairperson of the OSCE says, quote, the OSCE is ready to do everything it can within its mandate to facilitate full implementation of the agreed measures. But the European Council on Foreign Relations spoke with Chancellor Merkel, who, along with French President Hollande, was one of the guarantors of the agreement. German Chancellor Merkel was very cautious in her predictions of whether the ceasefire will hold. There is a real danger that the negotiations are a rather tactical delaying maneuver by the Kremlin. Nevertheless, the United Nations Security Council sanctioned the Minsk II agreements in a unanimous vote. And as the agreement was supposed to be implemented, there were some ups and downs, according to the New York Times. Some lingering violence was expected, given the recent intensity of the combat, yet overall, Ukrainian officials said the accord reached last week was holding. One of the main reasons it was difficult to implement the agreement was the stance of the Nazi-like Right Sector military group in the Ukraine. According to him, the agreements signed in Minsk have no legal force, contradict the Constitution, and therefore aren't legally binding on Ukrainian citizens. Besides, Russian President Putin aren't going to observe them anyway. Mr. Yarosh also appealed in his post to President Poroshenko to engage the United States and Great Britain in the next round of peace talks, as these two states follow clear-cut anti-Kremlin policies, unlike Germany and France. And what did President Poroshenko think of the ethnic Russian Ukrainians in the eastern part of the Ukraine? Speaking to a group of his supporters in the western part of the Ukraine, he had this to say.
Тому що у нас робота буде, у них немає. У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під дітей, під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків. У них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах. Бо вони нічого не вміють робити. І так, і саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
And the United States, a bipartisan group of senators, Amy Klobuchar, John McCain, and Lindsey Graham, visited the Ukraine in 2016. Here is part of their pep talk to Ukrainian soldiers.
проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
Our fight is not with the Russian people, but with Putin.
Ми боремося не з російським народом, але з Путіним.
Our promise to you is to take your cause to Washington.
Наша обіцянка – це те, що ми вашу боротьбу доведемо до Вашингтона.
Inform the American people of your bravery.
Проінформуємо американський народ про вашу відважність.
And make the case against Putin to the world.
When Biden and Putin met in Geneva in 2021, Biden assured Putin that he supported the Minsk II agreement. Because Joe Biden reiterated his support for Minsk, that's a major achievement for the Russian side coming out of these negotiations. To the Western press, however, Biden continued to demonize Putin. As the Ukrainian army gathered its forces on the border to the eastern regions, a military conflict seemed unavoidable, as reported in Asia Times. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has reiterated for the umpteenth time that the only basis for a settlement in eastern Ukraine is for Kiev to negotiate with the breakaway territories based on the Minsk II protocols. What about the Minsk agreement itself? Was Putin wrong to put so much faith in this agreement with the West? In a prank call, former President Poroshenko let the truth out. He said, quote, I needed these Minsk Accords to get at least 4 years to form the Ukrainian armed forces, build up the Ukrainian economy, and train the Ukrainian military together with NATO to create the best armed forces in Eastern Europe, created according to NATO standards. In case President Poroshenko's confession isn't enough, here is former Chancellor Merkel herself explaining the reasoning for the Minsk II agreement. Quote, and the 2014 Minsk agreement was an attempt to give the Ukraine time. She then expanded on her answer, quote, the Ukraine used this time to grow stronger, as one sees today. The Ukraine of today is not the Ukraine of 2014, 2015. We saw this with the Battle of Eisenbahnerstadt at the beginning of 2015, where Putin easily overran them. And I sincerely doubt that the NATO countries at the time could have helped them as much as they do today.
I should add, the United States unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement in 2019 without diplomacy with Russia.
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, was another important Cold War-era treaty. The purpose of the treaty was to eliminate all shorter-range and intermediate-range missiles from the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union. And under Trump, the United States withdrew unilaterally in August of 2019.
When President Putin said we urgently need a new security arrangement in December 15th, 2021, the United States explicitly refused to engage.
Indeed, Russia had made one last attempt to avoid war. Russia's foreign ministry on Friday released a comprehensive draft agreement on security guarantees between Russia and NATO. Quote, we are ready to immediately, even tomorrow, literally tomorrow on Saturday, to go for talks with the United States and a third country. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki later responded that the United States had seen proposals from Russia to start talks and is speaking with its European allies and partners. And the United States responded by saying that the a proposal to redraw European security was unacceptable.
When Ukraine and Russia reached a tentative peace agreement in March 2022, the United States sent the word, do not sign an agreement, no negotiation.
Yes, Putin claims that Boris Johnson talked the Ukraine out of the peace deal. The European conservative interviewed David Aramaya, who was not only the leader of the parliamentary faction of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, but was also appointed as the head of the Ukrainian delegation during the initial tentative peace talks in March and April. Russia was ready to end the war and withdraw its troops in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality just a few months after the invasion began, and was refused partly because of ex-British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who pressured Kiev into continuing the fight.
The U.S. has forgotten how to have diplomacy. There is none.
Oh, and diplomacy, the art and practice of conducting negotiations between nations.
weapons, they are the way to peace.
Well, now you know what Professor Sachs was talking about. Do you think weapons are the way to peace? If not, or if you just want to learn more, please contact us.